You are listening to Sheep Might Fly, a podcast of serial fiction and occasional essays written and read by Tansy Roberts. So I'm taking an interlude from our ongoing story serial, Something Frightful, for a reasonably timely, surprisingly, hot cup of history essay. Launching my new theme, and I wanted to tell you all about it. So this is going to cover the next 3 episodes, and then we will be back, and hopefully I'll have banked enough episodes that there'll be not too many more interruptions as we continue with Something Frightful. Okay, for those of you just joining us, the Hot Cup of History essays are a yearly project that I do. I pick a particular topic dear to my heart. I will write 3 essays on that historical topic, exploring different aspects. And then the essays do after the podcast get polished up, put together in books, and they're distributed to my Patreon subscribers. I am thinking of doing paperback releases at some point. If that's something you'd be interested in, let me know. If I do that, they will almost certainly be available from the Teacup Magic Emporium, my new author store, or perhaps generally from my public events, which I am doing more of these days. But for now, Hot Cup of History 3. Everything BC is good. Or, I haven't decided on the final title for this one, As Seen on Xena. My first reaction to Xena Warrior Princess was bemusement. The first episode that I watched all the way through was Beware Greeks Bearing Gifts, depicting a cut-down, remarkably small cast retelling of the Trojan War. And when I get to it, I think you'll be surprised which characters are included, if you know anything about the Trojan War. And if you don't, then do keep listening, because I'm going to tell you how it all is. So the second episode I watched of Xena was Athens Academy of the Performing Bards, City of the Performing Bards. Anyway, I will check that before I publish the essay. So that was a kind of clip show in which Gabrielle, who's Xena's young companion, who's a self-classified bard. She's basically the ancient Greek equivalent of the indie author. And she goes to this academy, she meets other bards, and they all tell each other stories. It's a great excuse for a clip show. One of the characters, who I believe is named Homer, they all tell different stories, and they use different clips, some from Xena, the actual show, but some from other movies. So one character who's really into violence tells a story, and they show clips from an old sword and sandal epic of the violence. And one guy tells the story of Spartacus as something that happened in the past, using film clips from the actual Kirk Douglas film. Now, if you know anything about history, you'll be thinking, hang on a minute, Xena is ancient Greece, we just had Troy, and you're telling me Spartacus has already happened? Yeah, no, it doesn't matter what dating you prefer for the Trojan War, Spartacus happened 1,000 years later. So what? I was very confused and a little bit cross because, I was a teenager, very quick for outrage. And then I fell in love with the show. It was hard to fall in love with Xena. The networks in Australia did not make it easy. I don't think I saw a single episode in chronological order for the first 3 to 4 seasons. They would just show them in random batches, at random times and random dates. It was like this elaborate scavenger hunt trying to find episodes. So I started digging deep, as I do when I fall in love with things. It was the closest to a missing episodes experience, honestly, than Doctor Who fandom. But I got my hands on behind the scenes materials. I started deep diving on how this show worked. And I learned that there was a really specific, intentional philosophy driving the creation of Xena Warrior Princess. And that was everything BC is good. Like, that's infuriating, right? Like, it challenged me. And even more so as a teenager, I was one of life's list makers, rule followers, continuity questioners. So the idea of deliberately allowing a chaotic montage of ancient world stories to just happen in no particular order, it was upsetting. But I really liked the show. To love Xena, I had to stop worrying and embrace the chaos. And it was good for me. Personal growth, all that. I kind of wonder what direction I would have gone in as a writer if not for the winning appeal of Xena, because it challenged me at just the right time to question a lot of things about what is set in stone and what is not. And now, as many of you may know, I am a creator who takes extreme liberties with classic stories on a regular basis. And I get why the show had to be that way. Sometimes you have to throw out accuracy and lean into vibes, especially when the task is as impossible as make a coherent timeline out of a story cycle that was never intended to be coherent. So one of the equivalents I often fall back on when talking about ancient myths is the other big shared story universe, or the two of them, in our pop culture world, DC and Marvel Comics. They work in remarkably similar ways, except, of course, that there is at least an attempt for coherence to some extent with the comics companies, being that there's a level of control over what that they publish. Though I do enjoy that in recent years DC Comics has thrown it all out the window and just, covered their chronology with shrug emojis. Sometimes you got to do that. So how DC Comics used to handle this was by rebooting its universe every 10 years to try and make sense of things. And generally what happened was that it flattened out the stories and took away the interesting bits. Marvel Comics, you would compress time to pretend that the characters really do have 50 or 75 years of relationship history while never getting older than 30. A sprawling mythical universe can't be expected to follow the same rules as an original story that follows maybe 1, maybe 10 characters. So, the mythic shared universe of ancient Greece was built ad hoc over centuries by countless storytellers, sculptors, playwrights, painters of pottery. It was a collaborative story space with no rules, no official canon. Of course, you can't now tame it into a coherent single-line narrative, not without losing most of what makes it awesome. And Xena, looking at that as a challenge, somehow, with their light-hearted, casual, and simultaneously deadly serious approach to the classics, just invited you all to lie back and allow yourself to believe in the world they created. Try and ignore any ancient civs lore that might be screaming in the back of your head. So they jammed Troy and Spartacus right next to each other in season 1. Likely not because they were hoping no one would notice, but they were hoping they would, that people would get the message as early as possible, not to expect that you knew what version of these stories you were going to get. And there are other elements to kind of shake things up. The accents are unapologetically default Californian, which I thought was really interesting in light of some of the waves of just outrage I've seen on the internet. Basically, one of my new hobbies apparently is watching what people have to say online about the new Christopher Nolan Odyssey film before it happens, because some of the social media responses have been kind of unhinged. The objections to the American accent, look, I get it. I get it. We all know British accents just feel more historically authentic. But that doesn't mean that they are. And so, like, getting really upset about it is like, pick your battles, man. All right, so Xena leaned into Californian. They made that choice early on, except the fact that because they filmed in New Zealand, if an actor, I assume, didn't feel they could pitch the California accent, or just sometimes didn't have to, the other default was Kiwi, which is kind of great. The characters regularly make anachronistic jokes. The fight scenes use Hong Kong cinema and wuxia as their main inspiration instead of old school sword and sandal. And that's particularly where they found a lot of their inspiration about how to create amazing choreography and fight scenes involving women. Because there were a lot more examples, frankly, in Asian cinema history than Western. And that's on us. That's embarrassing. But hooray for that too, because it made for a fantastic show. They made casting choices that were daring and ahead of their time, like choosing people of colour to play Helen of Troy, another 2026 talking point. Cleopatra, this was a brief era when people got very excited about the idea of, it's like, oh, hang on, Cleopatra was Egyptian, that's in Africa, right? Before it got overlaid with, yes, but the royal family was Macedonian. Anyway, both women, very attractive and beautiful, but beautiful performances. And yeah, but that kind of diversity was everywhere in the show. Thanks largely because they kept using the local acting pool on location in New Zealand, meant that the show regularly cast Maori, Samoan, and Pacific Island actors in key roles as well as background casting. Which is an area of media production that often lacks even period-appropriate diversity. It also gave a lot of New Zealand actors and behind-the-scenes people some really crucial experience, a lot of which then led into the productions of Lord of the Rings. Like, you can't look at the history of the making of the Lord of the Rings films without looking at Xena, which provided them with an awful lot of trained professionals ready to take on that next level challenge. And, you know, we have a wave of New Zealand actors who made it fully to Hollywood and big careers, started out in Xena. This is the tipping point. And not just New Zealand actors. I'm not going to lead into it because it's a very small part of this particular element of history, but Ryan Gosling, man. Ryan Gosling started out in Xena. So, I don't think it was his first part, but still, it's still pretty big. So, this is still the introduction. I'm nearly there, I promise. I'm getting to it. As it turns out, I just really wanted to talk about Xena. It's my happy place. So, Xena Warrior Princess wanted you to know from the start that they weren't following any preconceived Hollywood notion of how to tell stories about ancient mythology and history for a modern audience. And you can tell that for a start because it was full of women. Women were everywhere. Even in her evil backstory, Xena was networking like crazy. And now she was known to be a hero, which is the point of the story. It starts, it's her redemption tour, basically, is the whole show. She was regularly called upon by old friends, including women in positions of power and those struggling with a lack of agency. It can't be emphasized enough how important it was at this time to have an action show led by a woman, a complex, fiery, flawed woman who was allowed to be strong and damaged and soft and even funny. 2 years before Buffy took the credit for sarcastic female superheroes who knew how to fight monsters, Xena was doing it backwards in a leather corset on a horse. Now, I'm not going to get into unfair comparisons. We can have both Xena and Buffy. There was a beautiful time in pop culture history where we did. And they weren't even the only female-led action shows at the time. It was a glorious golden age. And afterwards, there was about 10 years in which we had nothing. Nothing but, like, men in cars shooting things. So this was a glorious time. We do not have to choose. Xena challenged media conventions. The show, again, this casual approach to continuity kind of pulled into a few other things. Actors reappeared multiple times as different characters, including main roles. I literally just saw on, I think it was Threads yesterday, somebody who has decided after a very long time to rewatch the Hercules series, which was the boyfriend show. It happened first. There were 5 telemovies. There was 1 season. During the first season, Hercules created a 3-episode run as a backdoor pilot to Xena. So they planned for the female-led spin-off right from the start. They knew that what they were doing was working. They said, look, somebody's going to rip us off. Somebody's going to create the female version of this. Let's get in there first. Anyway, so on Threads, I saw somebody who's like, oh, I'm watching Hercules for the first time in years. And Lucy Lawless turned up, playing a completely different character. And like 2 episodes later, she turns up as Xena. It's like, yeah, Xena's actually her 3rd character in the Hercules continuity. It's just what they do. They do it with everybody, even if they're in a main role. The most common thing was for actors to have one really substantial named character in Hercules and maybe a different one in Xena, but then they'd have crossovers. Some of them had small parts as well. It's just how they worked. Like, it feels in a lot of ways like it was run more like a theatre company and less like a big budget TV show. And that's kind of what I love about it, that little rep theatre thing, especially when they did start hanging all the lampshades on it. So yes, you might have, a couple of actors who play very small parts, then they get a big part, and then they become a recurring character. But then they get to play their old tiny part again. It's yeah. Anyway, they even did that with Lucy Lawless and their other stars. It's great. Episodes shifted wildly in tone. This is something else I often struggled with a little bit, but I also kind of love it now. You never knew if you were going to get drama or slapstick comedy or tragedy, a musical. It went back and forth in, wildly different tones. Characters were reincarnated in surprise modern day episodes, full of meta jokes and lore about the TV production itself. Every gimmick episode theme you can think of that might have turned up in science fiction shows or fantasy shows, Xena's done all of them. Like, they had a Groundhog Day episode. They did 2 musicals. They've done all these, they've done the mockumentary. They did everything, man. It's just such fun television. I will concede that a lot of what they did was also done by Hercules, which was also a pretty good show. Like, there's a lot about it that, the Kevin Sorbo of it all notwithstanding. There's a lot about Hercules that is kind of joyous, and a lot of the fun ideas that worked really well in Xena were even done first in Hercules and were done very, very well. However, Xena was just a better show. And partly it was because it did skew darker to balance out the comedy. I don't know, it just was a better show. Like, note for note, episode for episode, season for season, except, weirdly, for the 1998-1999 seasons, in which Xena had the least good season of the entire run, and Hercules had their best season. And weirdly, the balance tipped. But only briefly. And once again, you can have both. But it is really interesting that Hercules has kind of disappeared off the pop culture ledge, while Xena has retained, because the people who loved Xena loved it so much, because it wasn't like anything else that had ever happened before. It was nothing else like that out there. Okay, and there is the queer subtext as well, which taught a whole generation that if there's enough subtext, it can just be text. Some of the ways they worked around it at times seem baffling. And in fact, viewers were left to decide for themselves if the main leads were in love with each other, if they were just good friends, if they were in an incredibly open relationship. Some episodes leaned hard into the sapphic interpretation, some toyed with deniability, some played it weirdly straight. TV was a strange place then, and without understanding how rare it was to see LGBT characters on screen acknowledged, it's hard to understand why they made some of the story choices that they did. But yeah, a lot of it is based on the idea that people watching the show regularly are going to have a different experience to potential protest groups or casual viewers or journalists who might only watch key episodes because they were told there's something of interest in it. So yeah, it's a complex thing. Lots has been written about it. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm here to talk to you about history. Unlike the common media adaptation choice to present, and you see this a lot, the Iliad, the Odyssey, other classic Greek myth story cycles, without the active interference of the gods, like that's the one aspect that makes it silly. One big example, of course, Troy, 2004, apparently a work of staggering genius, if you believe men on the internet, in 2026. So there were versions that included the gods, but an awful lot of time, like to tell it as a historical action film, the gods get left out. Hercules and Xena went the other way. They leaned into the epic divine soap opera of manipulations, power games, interpersonal bullshit as sources for comedy and tragedy. Now, in Xena, actually in both shows, their Aphrodite, played as a clueless style Californian beach babe by Alexandra Tidings, was iconic. And who can forget her son Cupid, played by Carl Urban. Anybody who thinks he only plays terribly, terribly serious roles should definitely Google Carl Urban Cupid, just to see what pictures you end up with. But of course, Kevin Smith, his complex and electric performance as Ares, god of war, Xena's nemesis, stalker, ex-boss, worst nightmare, occasional comic foil, was just exceptional. Like, he was so good. And the way that they wrote him as a god was so interesting. All of the gods were they had a lot of human feelings that they didn't know what to do with, but they also had this incredible power. And yeah, that dichotomy, it's very hard to write, which is why a lot of people leave the gods out, because writing, very, very, very powerful characters is very hard to do in a relatable way. And Xena did an extraordinary job in conveying how, just the tone of how gods are treated in the ancient world, where they are basically flawed, chaotic people in a high-octane soap opera causing trouble. They're basically, the cast of Gossip Girl. Stories were retold, upside down, inside out, lots of little twists, shifts of focus. Xena hung lampshades on every deliberate error, daring you to suggest that the Emperor had no clothes. And anyone complaining about inaccuracies or confusing points or any choice ends up looking just as crazy, honestly, as some of the participants in the 2026 social media discourse, arguing over which parts of Christopher Nolan's Odyssey are going to be historically accurate. Let's just assume the answer is none of them. Historical accuracy, for a start, is not what myth is for. And it's definitely not what Christopher Nolan is for. This man couldn't even let us have like a real Dick Grayson in the role of Robin, or a Batman who stuck the job out for more than a decade. His Greek mythology is not going to be any version of accurate, but I find myself more and more, unfortunately, in the position of defending his narrative choices, which hurts me deeply as a very committed Nolan critic. But yeah, because the fact is, Greek mythology, it's not, that's not what it's for. It's not there to show you what Bronze Age history might actually have been like. Because the myths come to us over centuries. It's chaos. It's like complaining about the historical accuracy in Arthurian myth, when again, there are so many complex layers to Arthurian myth. And it's the fact that the story survived it all is what's interesting, not what characters are wearing when the stories are being told. I understand the Viking longboat thing was confusing, and I'm sure it will be justified. Anyway, if you're going to complain about Nolan's filmed version of the world of Greek mythology, and I'm definitely going to, I've blocked out most of July to be complaining about this film. I can't wait to complain about this film. But, it's okay to complain that his film is almost certainly going to be lacking in fight scenes where babies get thrown into the air for comic effect, or the moon might not be full literally every time it appears. And, whatever happens with this film, good, bad, indifferent, Xena will always be there for us to cheer us up afterwards. Okay, so the actual history that we see in Xena, as I have said, chaotic. And they didn't just take liberties with Greek myth. They played with Bible stories, Norse myth, Chinese, Celtic, Russian, Japanese, Indian, Mongolian traditions, Bulgarian throat singing. They even broke their everything BC is good mandate from time to time with a moment of common era flirtation, including Caligula, Boudica, and never forget a heavy metal rendition of Always Something There to Remind Me by Burt Bacharach and Hal David, as performed by warlords in the public baths, led by Jay from Play School. There is no other show like this in the world. Anyway, as you can tell, I've been wanting an excuse to spend some time with Xena. So, I thought a good theme for Hot Cup of History this year was looking at the real, all the inverted commas, history and historiography behind some of Xena's greatest hits. As always, there are going to be 3 topics. I know I'm going to have to do one on Amazons because they were so important to the run of Xena and they're really interesting to write about. I don't know what the 3rd essay is going to be. It might be on Caesar and ancient Rome. I might have had to write that essay already effectively for a different project. So that's the easy choice. If there are any other elements of history as portrayed in Xena that you would like to hear about, then let me know. I'm willing to take suggestions. So, our first essay will be a beginner's guide to the Trojan War, which I thought was a really important community service to help catch you guys up, just in case you needed a bit of refreshing before going to see that Christopher Nolan Odyssey movie, or even just to understand what the people in social media are flapping on about. So, I have planned a short, snappy outline of everything you need to know about the Trojan War. It is broken up into 3 episodes because the essay got really long, and 2 was not enough, and I'm sure you'll all be shocked to hear that. Short, snappy, here we go. A hot cup of Trojan War. Now, before I start, a little bit more about Xena. But I want to talk to you a little bit about the coverage of Troy in the Xena episodes, just so you understand what we're working with. So, start in Hercules, one of the telemovies before the Hercules Legendary Journey series started. These were much more based on classic Labours of Hercules stories. Anyway, in Hercules and the Lost Kingdom in 1994, Hercules prevents a young woman called Deianira, not the Deianira he later marries. This one is in fact played by a very young Renee O'Connor, who's Gabrielle in Xena. Anyway, he saves her from sacrificing herself to the gods. She tags along on adventures. She is far too young for any love interest. There's a hint of it's a little bit creepy, but we move past it. He's going to the lost city of Troy, where apparently no one's been for a really long time. Hidden by magic. They find the city. It's a whole movie of adventures. But at the end, by the way, this is going to include a lot of spoilers, but Deianira is revealed to be the rightful heir of the city. So she's actually based on Hesione, who is a princess of Troy, daughter of King Ilias. Anyway, so Deianira, who is not in the myths, Deianira Hesione is crowned queen. And that's it. That's a whole Troy that we got, really significant to that movie. And now you can forget everything that I just told you because it's not relevant. Because in Xena, in Xena Warrior Princess Season 1, when we first meet the god Ares, he's trying to tempt Xena back onto the path of evil. He's promising her an army of any warriors she wants. And Xena refers to Agamemnon, Achilles, and Hector, all big name Trojan War guys, as all long gone. Okay, so in Season 1 of Xena, Troy is apparently long gone in the past, those guys presumably dead. Then 6 episodes later, we get Beware Greeks Bearing Gifts, and it turns out that in fact Troy is not deep in the past. It is right at the end of its famous 10-year war. This does appear to be a completely different city called Troy to the one that Deianira was the queen of, unless it's several generations later. Or I guess maybe she was assassinated like 2 minutes after Hercules left. Anyway, Xena can't be blamed for the Hercules chronology, which is even more of a dog's breakfast, honestly. And it only makes sense as it does in Greek myth. Sometimes you can only manage it because Hercules, as the son of a god, presumably is a lot longer lived than most people. So, yeah. Anyway, back to Troy. It's been at war for 10 years under the rule of King Priam. So this is where we're at. Xena and Gabrielle are summoned by Xena's old friend Helen. Now, if she's an old friend, that does suggest that Helen was friends with evil Xena, but we'll move past that quickly. Helen needs out. I'll delve more into what happens in the episode later, after I've given you the historical context, in case you do need that Trojan War refresher. But the important thing is that Agamemnon, Achilles, and Hector, those guys that Xena mentioned previously, are absolutely out of the way when this version of the fall of Troy unravels. So when she said long gone, I guess she meant they died earlier in the war, or they left, which, a version of Troy in which Agamemnon dies before the end, frankly, is the best possible world. Particularly good news for both Clytemnestra and Cassandra, but we won't get into that. So we're still in this one Troy episode. Gabrielle also has a connection to a character in Troy, Perdiccas, who is her ex-fiancé, the one who was famously terribly boring. She ditched him to run off with Xena. We now find that maybe he's slightly hotter than she remembers. But, he's a recurring character. He'll be back. It's fine. It's not really relevant. He's basically a foot soldier. There are a lot of characters from the Trojan War story. As I said, they don't appear in this version because this version, as well a lot of Xena episodes, has a very small cast. So the people that we miss out on seeing sometimes get their own episodes at a later date. We saw Ulysses. Don't know why they made the choice to go with the Roman name for Ulysses instead of Odysseus. I guess that was a slightly more recognizable version at the time. Anyway, Ulysses and Penelope both appear in Season 2. He has a definite Xena vibe going on, but he ends up with Penelope, played by Gabby from Neighbours. And my personal favourite Trojan character, Cassandra, the truth-telling priestess, who predicts her city's doom and is ignored, actually gets rebooted as a princess of equally doomed Atlantis in Hercules' Legendary Journeys. I think another season later in 97. She's played by Claudia Black. This is a really good show, man. One of the things about going back and watching Xena is how many people in it became more famous later on. So, while Xena never shied away from bringing gods to the party, her actual Troy episode, Beware Greeks Bearing Gifts, doesn't include the active machinations of big hitters like Poseidon, Athena, or even Aphrodite. But they also all appear in their own stories across the breadth of the shows. The Golden Apples, which again, I'll be explaining soon, but they first appeared in a Hercules episode in season 2. Actually, it was like a month after Greek Spear and Gifts. This is the thing of... and that story actually introduced Aphrodite as a recurring character. And it placed Hercules' BFF Aeolus, that's basically his Gabrielle, in the position of Paris, choosing which of the 3 goddesses is the hottest, almost starting a war. And the golden apples turned up from time to time again as MacGuffins causing immortality and the like. All right, you can now consider yourself fully warmed up to the story of Xena, Troy, what we're doing here. So next week, I am going to tell you the history behind the story of Troy. That is the history of the history. That's what the word historiography means. It's one of my favourite things. It's when you actually poke at the history itself and figure out how it works. And I'm also going to start the grand synopsis, which will take us through most of the Trojan War story up to the point that the Iliad, the most famous retelling of the Trojan War story, ends. And then in the 3rd episode, I'm going to tell you about all the Troy stuff that is left out of the Homer version. And I'm also going to talk about the history of the Iliad itself as a story. One of the things that I found fascinating of this whole internet response to Nolan's Odyssey film is how many people out there think that they know what the Iliad and the Odyssey are and in fact don't like anything about it. They've heard of them as famous books, I think, and that's about it. So yeah, by the end of it all, you're going to be thoroughly educated and or entertained and hopefully inspired to go hunt down a crazy show from the 90s, which is not available anywhere on streaming. So good luck with that. Please hunt it down. It's so worth it. All right, I will see you next week for more Troy with a little bit of Xena. Thank you for listening to Sheep Might Fly. This podcast was recorded on Palawa land. I acknowledge and pay respect to the Tasmanian Aboriginal people as the traditional and continuing custodians of Lutruwita. Sheep Might Fly is produced and edited by Andrew Finch. You can sign up to my author newsletter for updates. Follow me on Instagram, Blue Sky, or Threads at TansyRR. And if you like this podcast, the place to support me is Patreon, where you can receive all kinds of bonus rewards, early ebooks, exclusive stories, access to Hot Cup of History essays. And you can hear these podcast episodes 2 weeks early. I recently launched the Teacup Magic Emporium at tansyrr.com, my author store where you can buy signed paperbacks, merch, and more direct from the author. Check that out today.